So this is the real-time working group, 20th of May 2020, I believe. Still 2020, hard to tell. Cool. So no, Heinrich, you have the first item on the agenda.
Yeah, so the Omnibus MR to start the Action Cable Puma server was merged. So I was just wondering if we want to deploy to staging using Omnibus, or we should just wait for the Kubernetes work. And I'm not sure about the status of that one, but like the container MR is in review.
That's probably a question for delivery, so I can't answer that for certain. I think the ideal situation is if we can get it deployed in Kubernetes first, then we don't have to like move it from a VM to Kubernetes in the future. So I would say if I can't speak for the delivery team, but I can guess, and I would say that probably if the Kubernetes stuff is pretty close, they would probably just rather wait for that. But we can certainly take that to them and ask them.
I think that we have like the Kubernetes work hasn't started. The Helm charts work is done to allow multiple Redis instances. The containerization works in second review, but like I think the delivery team are still working on Kubernetes for Sidekick, and it's unlikely that this will be prioritized anytime soon. I don't know, but like I would imagine that it won't be prioritized soon. So if we want to start collecting data on resource usage or anything like that, I think staging's pretty much our only choice.
Right, but what I mean is, don't the delivery team need to do some work, whether we're doing it in Omnibus or in Kubernetes, like to actually deploy it in staging?
My guess is like we'd need to update the chef cookbooks, right? And we could do that ourselves, or I don't
know. We can submit an MR to do that, but we also need to actually have the VMs available to deploy to, which I think is done with Terraform, but I've not actually done that myself yet. So you can see that we, what I'm saying is like, we need somewhere to run this. And on staging, if there's because I don't think we have, and I don't think we really want the model where the WebSocket connections run on the same nodes as the web nodes, right? So either way, we need some new thing, let's call it a VM for Omnibus or a pod for Kubernetes that, a cluster for Kubernetes, that is where this runs. And it's going to need to run, it's going to need to be set up by somebody, an SRE basically. So as I'm not an SRE, I can't give a like concrete answer, but I don't know. Maybe let's take that to the delivery team in the issue for that and see what they say, because I'm just speculating here. But the Sidekick stuff is kind of, some of that's blocked on something I'm working on right now. So there might be a bit of a gap in the schedule, inadvertently, thanks to me, if that helps. So we can see. But yeah, maybe let's take that to them in the issue where you've been discussing that with them and see what they say.
Yeah, the fastest way would be just to run on the existing nodes and just change the GitLab.rb configuration to enable Action Cable, right? But yeah, like you said, you probably don't want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, staging that might be okay, but we definitely don't want to do that in production. So like, it depends what I think it might be useful just as like a sanity check, if that's what you want to do. I'm not sure it's useful for like getting this much closer to production, but I think it's maybe useful to get like that little staging post on the way. So sorry, I didn't realize that was an option to like allow both from the same node. So if that is an option, maybe suggest that to the delivery team as well.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It doesn't really help us much in like collecting metrics and all that, because we can't even really collect like reasonable metrics on staging. But yeah, maybe just simple. If it's easy enough, maybe it's worth doing just for a sanity check, like you said, sanity check on the whole setup and production like setup with I think multiple Redis also in staging, right? Or yeah, things like that.
Yeah, I think exactly. So I think it would be nice as well to just say like as a demo type thing, right? Like you're not using a review app or whatever. Does it actually work in review apps? I guess it probably doesn't if it's not in the Helm charts yet, right? So it would be nice like for a place for people to play around with this and see how it goes. And even if it's going to be on staging for a while before it's on production, people can still give it a go and report issues and stuff like that, right? Like I'm not 100% sure that it will be allowed anyway, because like maybe they'd want to keep the configuration of staging and production a bit closer together. But if it is allowable, I think there's probably some value in just doing that and getting the feedback early.
Yeah. So basically, I agree that it doesn't really help get us any closer to deploying it on production. But I think like there is value for other people who aren't involved in the working group to have a chance to see it and kind of use it. And like having done the Dockerization work, like it's real, like it's surprising how easy it is to kind of switch it on and to kind of see the thing in action. Possible even that other teams might want to already start building features on top of it, because once you have it set up and working, like at least any feature in the sidebar should be relatively easy to add. Since we update the whole issue anyway, we just need to publish more updates through the sidebar channel, like broadcast issue updates or something the channel's called, or the feature flag's called, that enables that channel. So I think from that point of view, and even just to show progress, like it would be good, but it depends on how much work it's
involved.
And
it sounds like the balance of work that's been done so far is like the feature work is fundamentally pretty much done as far as we know, but we need to get feedback, and like to get feedback in production there's a whole bunch of other work that's still in progress, but in staging we can maybe short circuit some of that if the infrastructure teams are okay with that by running it on the same nodes as we serve HTTP traffic from. So I think we're all agreeing basically.
Okay, I think like next step there then might be to open that issue for the delivery team and see if it's a non-starter. Like you said, if they're not okay with having a kind of separate infrastructure on staging from production, then it's a no start anyway.
You just muted yourself, John.
Sorry, yeah, no, I just mean like we can't progress with it if they're not happy with the two deployments being different, right? So we should find that out first. So I think the next step is just create the issue.
Yeah, and there might be other options as well. Like maybe we could enable it on dev.gitlab.org, because as far as I'm aware, that's a single whatchamacallit, it's just a single node, or ops.gitlab.net. I'm not quite sure how that's deployed, but that might be another option as well. Like we do have other instances where we could try things like this out. We don't really use issues on either of those instances, but there's no reason, like as far as I'm aware, that we couldn't start just playing around with them on those. So yeah, I think create that issue and sort of say, here's where we are with the various options. Like we'd like to get this tried out somewhere, and see what they say.
Also, I think another thing to add, like on staging, I think we could also do it's like a dry run for the whole stack, like Cloudflare, HA proxy, all that.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Are there any metrics we could get from staging that actually would be useful? I mean, we had Matthias had some concerns about memory usage, but I take the point that gathering the number of connections is probably not realistic from staging. Like it's not used in that way. But things like CPU and memory, we could probably get an idea of.
So the quality engineering team, I think Grant Young in particular, have some like reference architectures where they run like performance tests, right? Like it might be interesting to see as another strand of the work for this, like if they can incorporate this into those somehow. And like, I don't know if some of those can run against, like, because those run against an instance that they spin up. So they could just try enabling this feature flag and running the existing tests first of all, and just see, like, does enabling this like create a noticeable difference? Because if it does, that's a thing we'll have to address. And then we could get into more sophisticated, like, does enabling this feature flag and actually using it impacts the test results? But like, I think that's worth exploring too. Yeah.
There were some concerns about the fact that this adds, Henrik, what did you mentioned? It was like 1 gigabyte for two servers, 2 instances of the server, or something like that. It adds like 1 gigabyte to the resource requirements.
Yeah, 2 workers, the default setup. I just copied the default Puma configuration, so it's like 2 workers. And I think it was Jason or whoever, yeah, I think Jason mentioned it in the Omnibus MR when he was merging it. He said like this adds 1 gig memory usage if you enable it. I think it's kind of expected already. We kind of knew that, you know, when we boot Rails, it's going to be like around that number, 600 MB or something, right?
Yeah, and I think Matthias just found that like basically all of that is the application. Like, so like, you know, there's a possibility that we could try and slice out the part of the application that's used for WebSockets, but then like you get into issues where like you might add a feature and then you need to tell whatever's slicing that out that that's also used by WebSockets now. So yeah, I think it's just a thing we have to live with.
So as an example of that, during the review of the, like I linked it in the second point in the agenda, during the review of the, I don't know what you call it, like Dockerization MR, one of the reviewers, I think it was DJ, pointed out that we probably don't need docutils Python package, right, in that container. And actually, if you look through the initializers in the GitLab application, there is essentially like a ton of stuff we could strip out if we're only running WebSockets. Like there's graphics magic. Do we need that to run? Like if I don't know if the whole application won't boot without that, but if it does.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like we probably don't need graphics magic for the web nodes either. I'm pretty sure any background jobs use that. So
yeah, so like there's potentially like if we wanted to go down that route, but yeah, like if we ever wanted to say, I guess if we ever wanted to send Markdown over the wire, then we'd need to re-add the docutils package, and that's the position we're in. And then there's also the thing that we want to potentially move to Anycable at some point. And how far do we want to go down the road of slicing off pieces of the application only to switch to Anycable in the future anyway?
yeah, I think a lot of the stuff we're blocked on right now is feedback, and this enabling this on like an existing node that's serving the web traffic doesn't get us a lot of the feedback, but it does get us some of the feedback. So we may as well shoot for that. And I think that's probably the main focus from here on out, right? Is like finding ways to get feedback on this like as incrementally as possible and start addressing any issues we find with that.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we need somebody to own the issue, like creating the issue for the delivery team. Like I'm happy to do that unless somebody else wants to take it. I'll take that as a no. So, okay, cool. What's the second to do there, Sean?
I was still writing this up, but it was just to like, at least, I don't know if we've already done this and I just forgot about it or I missed that meeting, but like sync up with grants and the people working on the reference architectures and ask them to enable WebSockets and run the existing performance tests, because these I haven't written this out yet. These reference architectures like use the performance test suite to check that they are valid. So what we want to do is enable WebSockets and enable the feature flag possibly, but not do anything else, and see if that reference architecture still holds, or if the additional memory usage from having WebSockets even just available causes some issues that we need to address. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there was also an issue where Matthias pinged Grant regarding the reference architecture and performance tests. But yeah, but we could probably spin this up into a new issue to discuss more details on how we want to do it.
Yeah, or if you can find that issue, that's fine too.
Cool. Do we need to find an owner for that?
I'm gonna suggest Heinrich to just like see if he can find the existing issue first of all, and then maybe go from there.
Yeah,
He's already done
the
it. Classic Heinrich.
Yeah, the issue isn't really related, so yeah, I think it's better to open a new issue or something. But yeah, I could take that and yeah, open the issue and discuss details.
Okay, thanks, Henrik. The second item was we've already talked about, that's the containerization. I don't really have too much to update on that. I think it might be ready, but I don't know. It's in its second review. Kind of at the outer limits of my knowledge on this, to be honest. And there are a few things that, like a bit of feedback from Jason on the MR. If you want to jump in and give any suggestions as well, I'd really welcome them.
So have you started working on the Helm side? Not you. There's like anybody started working on the Helm side, or is it just the Dockerization at the moment?
It's just Dockerization. What would need to be done on the Helm side?
Get a lot of help from Jason and DJ is my normal approach. But all I meant with that is like, as it's getting closer, like it's actually usable, it might be possible to start testing this out with the Helm charts right now. I mean, honestly, like I've tried to spread the load around the distribution team for some of the work I've been doing, but Jason's just taken a bunch of it anyway. Maybe that's been your experience too. Yeah, I would. This might be a good time to like at least get in touch with them and say like, or ask them on that MR, say like, I want to start putting this in the Helm charts. Can I just like basically clone over the existing like Puma stuff, or should I start from scratch? Like, what's the best approach here? Because they're all like subcharts within the charts repo. So there's like well, it's actually called web service now, I think. So do we build off that? Because like they build off each other, right? Like we have a web service chart and a Sidekick chart and a migrations chart, which all run the Rails application in some form. Like what's the best sort of starting point to start like bashing around is where I'd sort of start with that and say like, should I just build it off this, or should I start building it off that? Because once you do that, like you'll at least be able to start trying it out and get some feedback.
So do Helm charts, like I'm completely ignorant of this. So do Helm charts basically do what Docker Compose does? If you're like Docker Compose gives you like a standard, you can run Docker Compose up, it'll run one of each container that you've specified in the Docker Compose file. And so is Helm like a production ready version of that basically?
Yeah, kind of. So like obviously it's more complicated because it's more it's using Kubernetes, but yeah, basically like you tell Helm like I want to spin up this application and I want to disable this service and enable this service, or whatever the application is you configure. And so here we'd be saying like the WebSocket thing is off by default, but like you can turn it on maybe, and each subchart sort of God, I'm probably going to expose my ignorance here if anybody who actually knows about this watches it. But charts don't map one-to-one to Docker images, but they're pretty close. So like, you could have two charts that use the same Docker image in different ways, but the idea is to have like the Docker images have different entry points depending on what you're doing. So you can think of it as like inheriting a Docker image as like building a chart off another chart, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you could have like one chart that runs the image with a bunch of environment variables, and then another chart that runs it with a different bunch, right?
Exactly. And some of these charts do things which we might need here, which are like create a config file on the file system. So like we have GitLab RB that generates that in Omnibus. But in the Helm charts, they use a slightly different approach where you just sort of you generate it at when you run Helm, basically. is the limit to my knowledge with that.
That's good. Yeah, thanks. That's really informative. I'm aware we're kind of pushed for time a little bit. I want to move on to the next thing, just because I'd like to. We're in the last week, basically, of the working group, essentially against the date that we set at the start. But I think we can probably push that out a little bit. But I'd like to provide, Christopher is the executive sponsor. I'd like to provide sort of an update on how we're tracking against progress against what we set as exit criteria. I'll have a look at I've linked an MR that I made to the page just to try and tidy up some of the points and mark progress against the exit criteria. But now that we've just had a conversation about the Helm charts, I'll probably need to look at that again and add that as another step if it's not in there already. But yeah, if you wouldn't mind taking a look at that MR, anyone, and adding, removing, suggesting things, and approve it if you think it's okay.
Yeah, I think one thing there was like we could probably nudge the available on .com exit criteria forward as soon as it's enabled on an environment we can control, even if it's still quite a long way from, it wouldn't necessarily move forward far, but like, it would be a step towards that, right? Like,
right.
So I'll add a comment to the MR anyway.
Thanks. Yeah. And bearing in mind that the two exit criteria were delivering the first feature to self-hosted customers and the second was delivered to .com. The first one, I think, in theory at least, any self-hosting customer can run this now, right? I mean, if they jump through all the hoops like to enable it, like it's not on by default, so we wouldn't consider it released or anything. But I think we could say there's like significant progress against that as a goal. We could include some more documentation maybe, and then any customer could switch it on. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't know.
Yeah, but it's kind of, I don't think we want to like document that it's behind a feature flag or anything, or like announce the feature when we haven't actually tested it in some way, right, in production.
Yeah, for sure. The one that's though probably the limiting factor is the deployment to .com. So I mean, I think it's fine to push out the end date of the working group, but we should probably try and get an estimate. And I'm not asking for one in the call, but based on how long it took to do the Sidekick migration, if somebody who has knowledge of this could help us get an estimate of when we should set the next date for winding up the working group, and meeting the exit criteria.
John, Jav and Skarbek in delivery will have a really good idea of that, and they'll also know like what's going to be easier and what's going to be harder. So like easier is it's not an existing workload, like we can just turn it on or off, like we don't have to worry about breaking existing stuff. Harder is that it's not an existing workload, so we need to figure out like all the metrics and stuff that we talked about. So yeah, I think if you ask them, they'll be able to give the best input there.
So who was that, Sean?
Jav and Skarbek, the two SREs on delivery, because they've been doing most of the work on migrating the Sidekick stuff over.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I'll check that out and ask them to see if, I don't want to make it seem like we're trying to push this up their agenda or anything, just get an estimate for when we should set the next date, that we potentially could exit the working group with everything completed. And also, like, if we're taking on the work for Helm charts and we've taken on the work for Docker, it's possible we could also like take on some of the work for Kubernetes as well. But we'll see. That's everything in the agenda. Does anyone have anything else? No. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll see you in 2 weeks.